And I've introduced many people, rarely with so much pleasure or trepidation, because like assigning a sermon, a guest preacher, you never know what's going to be said, right? And yeah, sorry. But he's a trusted source. He's a trusted source. I'm the lay academic fellow here. My sacred learning is something Pusey House has always been meant to offer to the university as an informal chaplaincy since its inception in the 19th century. And we're consolidating the good now. I'm attempting to do that, and to offer this more regularly to you in the form of theological conferences, recollection lectures, and other treatments of ideas in a serious and thoughtful manner from the perspective of the Catholic tradition, lowercase c, as broadly as we can understand it. So Charles Foster is here, Professor Charles Foster, or is it Dr. Charles Foster, veterinarian? Or is it the barrister? I have never seen him in a wig. I've never seen him wear one. I'm sure he has it somewhere squirreled away. Or is it Badger? Is it the man crossing the epistemic divide between humans and other creatures so as to better understand, I think in your very words, and forgive me if I anticipate anything you might say, so as to better understand the person, the other creature laying next to us in bed at night, if we're so lucky to have someone who's both there and confusing and wonderful and perplexing and lovable, but a complete, with whom we have such great epistemic distance that we need to go study other things in order to understand this person better. So Charles is someone, he's a T.E. Lawrence of our time to a certain degree, an explorer, a man who's lost parts of his body going to the North Pole, yes, who's not terribly important parts, I guess, for a writer, but parts nevertheless, and he may tell you more about that. A man whose book I've alluded to being a beast. He went out and tried to be a badger, urban fox. Were you hunted like a stag also? Yeah, hunted like a stag. That's an 80s rock song, I think, right? Hunted like a stag, but it's also something that Professor Dr. Charles Foster, writer extraordinaire, has done. This man writes books faster than I read them. It's almost rude. It's almost rude how fast he writes really good books. And if you want to hear one of his good books read to you, he nearly lost movement in his jaw in a 2 days' time reading out for Amazon his book Being a Beast. A really, real treat if you have a nice long road trip. Now that being said, he's also a professor here in the university, law faculty at Green Templeton College, just up the street. Currently, his work is on questions of personhood and identity. And with that being said, I've asked him to do something because in all of our conversations over the years we've known one another, he's always been giving me little vignettes into what I would call his theology of nature. And so I've asked him if he wouldn't mind terribly just presenting a little more of it in an open forum to us here at Pusey House and to the wider community in Oxford. So with that being said, I give you Professor Charles Foster for his theology of nature.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. Father George, all, thank you for your welcome. Long after I agreed to do this talk, I realised what a ludicrously big brief it was. When I agreed to do it, I thought it would be enough to tell a few tales of my own epiphanies in woods and up mountains, and then utter a few uncontentious platitudes about why it wasn't heretical to have those epiphanies. But then, as I thought more about it, I realised that I had to do rather more than that. I saw, to my horror, that I'd have to try to say what sort of creatures I thought human beings were. And that was because a lot of Judeo-Christian thinking about the non-human world amounts to saying, well, we can't say much about what a badger is, except that it's radically different to us, and we're supposed to have dominion over it. Well, fair enough, I thought. What I'll do is I'll tell the woodland tales, I'll then sketch a rough anthropology, and then say why I thought that simply saying non-humans aren't like us isn't good enough. And then I thought some more. And I realised that to give a remotely satisfactory Christian anthropology, I'd have to say something not only about what the mission of humans is, but something too about the eternal destiny of humans, and compare and contrast those with the purpose and destiny of non-humans. I took comfort in that Victoria Wood sketch, which you might know. Victoria Wood plays a radio agony aunt, and she's sieving through the reader's questions to her. looking disgustedly at all the letters to do with sex. Sex. And she finally alights on one, which she thinks is a serious question. Thank you, Kitty, she says. Thank you, Kitty. Here's a proper question. Do animals go to heaven? Well, Kitty, no, they don't. And then she moves on to the next question. Now, even if that wasn't going to be my answer to that specific question, I thought I might be able to deal with that issue and related issues as concisely. And then I thought some more. And I realised that, for reasons which I'll explain, I'd have to attempt a theodicy. By that time, I was starting to panic, because I was being asked to summarise, as far as I could see, in 50 minutes or 20 minutes for questions, the entire history, current state, and future of the cosmos. The best way to start panicking is to start talking. And so I'll stop apologising for the inevitable inadequacy of this talk. You'll have to blame Jonathan for asking me to do such an impossible job. The only other apology which I'm going to have to make at this stage is that I'm going to have to generalise wildly. And that's particularly true when it comes to summarising historical facts. So if you come at me later with counterexamples, my response will almost certainly be quite right, but it seems to me that the preponderance of evidence suggests that, ... So I want to start with my experience, and I don't think that's illegitimate. There is a deep suspicion in the academy about feelings and intuitions. It's not the usual way in which progress is supposed to be made. If you believe most academics, intellectual progress is made by someone sitting quietly in the library, getting an idea, and then going out and setting the world on fire with that idea which has been conceived bloodlessly. I don't think that's how intellectual progress is made. It's certainly not how I think. Feelings and intuitions for me are primary, or at least need to be attended to, because they generally have something worthwhile to say. The relevant intuitions here are vertiginously old, and they well up from the deepest parts of me. So, what are my relevant feelings? When I walk through a wood, or I go up a mountain, I feel better than when I walk through a shopping mall. I feel that a wood and a mountain is a better place to be than a shopping mall. I feel that's where I'm meant to be. I feel a sense of well-being and companionship with the non-human creatures all around me, of shared participation in a great enterprise, and an enterprise which is holy. Now, that's not just my sense, it's a sense which is ubiquitous. Human thriving in many domains is associated with exposure to the natural world. We increasingly recognise this. If you're a cynical CEO who wants to squeeze the maximum work out of your employees, you make sure that their workstation looks out on a tree. If you are a hospital patient, you will recover faster if your hospital bed looks out over a field. There's a massively reduced incidence of ADHD and depression if you have access to a wood. Now, that sense finds expression in many religious creeds. So Hinduism has not only sacred cows, of course, but it has temples devoted to monkeys and snakes and many other animals. It's vegetarian, as Buddhists and Jains are. Jain monks would sweep the ground in front of them so they didn't kill anything by walking on it. The very landscape divinized in Hinduism. If you go for a walk in India, you're likely to go for a walk up the breast of a goddess or up the hip of a god. Many other creeds, of course, have, for example, sacred mountains, but they tend not to be sacred mountains which are sacred because they fitted into an encompassing scheme of landscape holiness. It seems to be a sort of rather ad hoc allocation of holiness to the landscape, usually. The Judeo-Christian tradition is an Eastern tradition, but in this respect it's rather anomalous. Judaism was and remains the most suspicious amongst religions of communion with the natural world. It feared any confusion between the creature and the created. It always saw the observation of boundaries between the creature and the created as central to its mission. And it said the boundaries were established at the creation: light, day, land, sea, clean, unclean, and so on. And it's true that many of the great festivals of Judaism are arranged around the agricultural year, bound to the natural world in that sense. It's true that at Sukkot, Jews are enjoined to live outdoors in transient shelters so they can look up at the sky and they can remember their origin as wanderers. But Rabbinic Judaism, for historical reasons, was an essentially urban industry. Part of Israel's big break with its Talmudic past was the birth of a new race in the state of Israel of outdoor Jews who tended orange groves and hiked and fought in the desert. Howard Jacobson, one of my favourite writers, British Jewish writer, observes of a Jewish protagonist in one of his novels that in the highly improbable event of his being asked to nominate the most un-Jewish thing he could think of, he'd be hard-pressed to decide between nature and football. But it's in Christianity, I think, that we see the most callous observations about the natural world. And I'm not just talking about the dreadful track record of US evangelicals in assuming that because the world will ultimately be renewed, there's no harm in trashing it now. But about people who one would have thought and hoped might know better. Say, the Jesuit theologian Joseph Rickaby. Brute beasts not having understanding and therefore not being persons cannot have any rights. We have no duties of charity or duties of any kind to the lower animals, as neither to sticks or stones. Augustine, not my favourite person, as will appear over the next 3/4 of an hour. A reason has not been given to animals to have in common with us, and so, by the most just ordinances of the Creator, both their life and their death is subject to our use. Aquinas, it's not wrong for man to make use of animals, whether by killing them or in any other way, whatever. Dreadful comments. In those dreadful comments, there are two broad themes. Firstly, the Genesis mandate to subdue the earth. I will return to that. Secondly, consciousness is made the lodestone of moral significance. That's a worrying usage. Accounts of dignity that depend on someone's capacity for reason, as is the case in many Kantian and related accounts, would deny moral significance to many of the humans in hospitals and schools and nursing homes. We know that the premise behind Rickaby's callous assertion that brute beasts have no understanding is simply wrong. Consciousness appears to be ubiquitous in the natural world. Again, a subject to which I'll return briefly. There have been less inglorious moments of reflection about the natural world in the Judeo-Christian tradition. Animals, after all, were, in the Genesis account, intended as the original companions for man. The Kabbalists talk in terms that will be immediately recognized by any Hindu or Buddhist about the porosity of the membrane that separates us from non-humans, and about techniques for shuttling across that membrane, for experiencing oneness with the natural world. Solomon knew the language of the birds. Elijah was fed by the ravens. St. Francis talked about brother ox. In Celtic Christianity, God is experienced in the wild things, in the turning of the wave, in the sunlight on the back of a gull. St. Cuthbert prayed all night immersed up to his neck in the sea, with the natural world surging all around him, not to mortify his flesh, but because he wanted to feel one with the world. And when he came out, he was warmed and dried by otters. In the Eastern Church, the notion of the imminence of God is, if not paramount, certainly a lot more prominent than it is in the West. So, each Orthodox, first thing in the morning, prays, Holy Spirit, giver of life, present in all places and filling all things, come and abide in us. And if you're asking for the same Holy Spirit to be in you as is present in all things, presumably you're acknowledging your oneness with the mushroom and the fox in whom the Spirit also dwells. Transcendence has become in the Western Church the dominant way of thinking about God. We can talk about why that might be the case. I have some ideas about it. I think certainly in the Protestant tradition, it may have something to do with a conviction rooted in psychology rather than theology, one's feelings, the things inside you, can't tell you anything useful about God. And an irrational extrapolation from that to conclude that things inside the natural world can't tell you useful things about God. So although in the Western Christian world there's often lip service to the notion that the natural world exhibits or explicates the divine, there's little systematic recruitment, it seems to me, of that idea. Yes, every English church has its flower rota and its harvest festival, every English grave has its flowers, but generally the natural world is marginal. It's looked at with suspicion. The great medieval cathedrals have their carvings of the green man, the embodiment of natural wildness, but you get the impression that they were never commissioned by the ecclesiastical authorities. But instead they were done rather naughtily in dark corners of the cathedral by anarchic stonemasons who secretly and illicitly held old heretical beliefs. The church's response to the old reverence for nature was either to baptize the old nature spirits, give them new Christian names, or to seek to destroy them. It was the Romans who cut down most of the sacred groves of the nature mystical druids, but the Christian missionaries who came with Augustine of Canterbury cut down most of the remaining ones, citing biblical verses about pulling down the high places of the pagan gods. And it certainly was the Christians who, in the name of Christ, tortured and burned and drowned the wise women they called witches, whose only crime was to live alone, have clairvoyant relationship with their cats, and the same intimate and ecstatic rapport with the natural world, which has characterized almost all behaviorally modern humans that there have ever been. Baptizing the old nature gods, the gods who dwelt in the land and who were associated with particular places, was a more successful strategy than that. Many holy wells obviously became pilgrimage sites and were named after Christian figures rather than the old gods. Sacred trees like yews were incorporated often physically into the Christian world. That's why we have yews in Christian churchyards. Of course, for lots of Christian history, the wild places were genuinely threatening. They were the haunt of wolves and outlaws. And it's perhaps not terribly surprising that they were populated in the imagination of many people by demons. The church authorities were keen to see wild places that way. Those authorities were urban and elite, and they had political and economic vested interests in subduing the surging wildness, whether it was wildness in a wood or wildness in the political consciousness of the people. And it wasn't hard for them to find scriptural pretexts for that. I'll come in a moment to the Genesis accounts. We'll see there some very, very early signs of rebellion that affected the created order, even if it wasn't rebellion which was initiated by the created things themselves. Jesus went into the wilderness to be tempted by the evil spirits, and it wouldn't be hard to conclude from that that the wilderness was the particular dwelling place of evil. The early ascetics of the Egyptian and Syrian deserts went into the wilderness precisely because it was a battleground. They would meet and grapple with the demons there in a way that they wouldn't if they were living at home in Alexandria or Sidon. I think it's wrong to conclude from that the wild is a particularly diabolical place. Goodness knows anyone who lives in a city knows that there are temptations here. Those ascetic combats were staged in the wilderness because there were fewer distractions from the combat. The ascetics could land more punishing blows on the demons there than they would be able to if they had to leave the fight to do the school run or nip round the corner to the shops. But nonetheless, it was commonly concluded that the wild was a particularly diabolical place. I'll look in a moment at what Scripture says about the nature of the created order, but generalizing wildly, the Western Christian world has tended to look at nature either with hostility or not to look at it at all. In most of the visual art of the Western Christian world, until at least the 18th century, nature is depicted as a backdrop for the activities of real interest and significance, human concerns. So nature's a stage on which we strut. Aristotle, of course, made a an attempt at a systematic zoology, showing a real interest in the natural world for its own sake. But he was very unusual. The church followed him in many respects, but by and large it didn't follow him in that. No one, so far as we know, builds very significantly on his systematic work, although they were natural historians, for another 1,500 years or so. From Herodotus onwards, we have bestiaries of fanciful creatures, which are used as vehicles for moral points or merely amusing stories. There's no systematic fascination in the natural world for its own sake. We have to wait until the mid-17th century for any real admiration of nature. Throughout the Renaissance and the Middle Ages, infused with Christian theology though they were, most people, reflecting specifically Christian prejudices, reserve their praise for not wildness, but cultivated land, gardens, orchards, ornamental ponds. Untamed nature was associated with brute beasts. Animal passions were the enemies of real piety. They had to be fought. And for many, it followed that nature had to be fought as well. So the natural landscape itself was dangerous and corrupt. Eden was imagined as smooth, symmetrical, ordered. The jaggedness of real mountains was seen as a sign of the fallenness of the world. Anyway, good Western Christians had better things to do than look at birds. Their real home, after all, was not here. Their destiny lay in heaven, and they ought to concentrate on getting there rather than on bird watching or mooning generally about the natural world. There was a suspicion of anything that wasn't straight. It was a straight and narrow road that led to salvation. Winding roads, which are the only sorts of roads you ever get in the natural world, the roads created by rivers and foxes, led to destruction. Tangledness was of the devil. It was for ensnaring the unwary. The devil himself is a roaring lion, prowling round, seeking for souls to devour. Wolves populate the woods, and have you ever noticed in lots of medieval romances, it's always in the woods that sexual temptation is to be found. And let's get back to him, body-hating Augustine, promulgating original sin, had taught that the natural process of birth brought sin into the world, that it was the greatest catastrophe of all. Ontological catastrophe linked to naturalness. The Western Church believed him, the Eastern Church never did. When the Reformation preached the supreme value of the interior life of the individual and the consequent inconsequence of the wild forests and moorlands, nature finally lost its battle for the heart of the West. Of course, there were fightbacks. Romanticism protested its love of nature in flowery odes and sonnets. But the love was often self-love. Often they didn't really want the landscape itself. They wanted a sensation that the landscape might help them to have. Often the land was used as a mirror in which they could admire themselves. And anyway, in the eyes of the church, the Romantics were often seen as diabolical themselves. They were long-haired and self-indulgent and licentious. Their very love of the natural world confirmed the suspicions of the clerics. The natural world depraved, and only depraved people would take delight in it. Denial of the natural world wasn't just a religious meme, of course. Locke urged his readers in Concerning Human Understanding to disregard all those areas of the natural world which have no connection with man's social and ethical conduct. Anyway, to cut a long and depressing story short, Western Christianity's relationship with nature, insofar as it has been a relationship at all, has been, with some glorious exceptions, inglorious. So, with that hinterland, is it legitimate for me to feel what I do feel when I walk through a wood or I walk up a mountain? What should our attitude to the non-human creation be? It would be logical to start with the Genesis accounts and what the New Testament makes of them, but I want instead to start with a general look at the sort of place that the universe appears to be. Newton saw the natural world as clockwork, ordered. In principle, everything was explicable and predictable. There was a great debate between Einstein and Niels Bohr. Could any theory, in principle, correspond perfectly to the world? Einstein, despite being the advocate of relativity, said yes. Bohr said no. You will know about the Heisenberg uncertainty principle. You can't speak of the behavior of particles independently of the observer. So it's the relationship between observer and observed which conditions the entire way that the universe behaves. A curious and exciting and repercussive thought. Now, if Bohr was right, it would follow that if two particles were ever related to one another, they would ever thereafter be related, however far apart in space or time they were. Now, we know that in fact turns out to be true. We have the idea of quantum non-locality. Now consider that everything in the universe was very close to everything else in the universe at the time of the Big Bang. That means that everything in the universe is instantaneously conditioning the behavior of everything else in the universe instantaneously. The universe looks like one organism. At the very least, putting it at its lowest, there is vibrant causal connectivity between each thing. That sort of instantaneous, eternal effect of X and Y on one another is relational. It looks terribly like the effect of one consciousness on another. A word about consciousness. No one has ever been able to suggest how consciousness could have emerged from unconscious matter. There are endless books written about the subject. All of them, if they're honest, amount to that conclusion. And that's forced many to go back to the ancient presumption and the most parsimonious conclusion that matter itself is conscious in some respect. And these aren't the long-haired hippies of the philosophical world. These are mainstream people, Whitehead, Strawson, Nagel, and so on. Jeff Kripal in the States puts it superbly. Mind is plainly mattered. If I go outside and an articulated lorry runs over my head and crushes my brain, but the way in which my mind is manifest will be affected. But matter also appears to be minded in some way. What effect should that have on our thinking about the world? Well, when we deal with rocks, let alone when we deal with worms and rabbits and children and wives, we're dealing with minds. Part, as I suggested, is the divine mind. I hold to Ian McGilchrist's view of individual consciousness. Individual consciousness is what happens when universal consciousness collides with and begins to inhabit matter. That part of consciousness, which is inhabited by that bit of mind, takes forever, perhaps by divine condescension, the shape of that piece of matter. That's what's meant by our individuation. So that's how we're to regard individual rabbits, rocks, humans, children, and wives. So how should we look at the universe? As a place, I think, every single fundamental particle of which is infused with mind, and every single particle of which is intimately connected with and in communication constantly with every other particle. All is one, non-severable. And if you want to see parallels with the notion of divine simplicity, well, I won't stop you. And now I have to turn to the Genesis accounts. We've got two creation accounts in Genesis. Genesis 1 gives the cosmic perspective. Man's created on the sixth day. Genesis 2 gives a more local, more anthropocentric account. There, man is the first living creature on the scene. He arrives even before the plants, let alone the animals. The original intention, as I've mentioned, was for the animals to be the companions of man, but they proved inadequate. That's an important observation. So if at any point I seem to be suggesting that we can get as much from our rabbit as we can from our best friend, this gives a lie to it. Eve, consequently, because of the inadequacy of animal relationships, is fashioned from the rib of Adam. Then comes the fall. Now, the talking snake is quite plainly an ordinary created animal. It's not Satan. Cursed are you among all animals and among all wild animals. But it's a figurative snake. Natural snakes don't talk. Before it was cursed, it apparently walked upright, because afterwards it's cursed to go on its belly. I think it's clear too, and it's at this point that I'll start hearing sharp intakes of breath from you, I expect, but it's clear that physical death is not a consequence of the fall. Man's sentence after the fall wasn't a death sentence. It was a sentence of expulsion from the garden. The tree of life was in the garden, and God was concerned that with the knowledge which man had got from eating the fruit, man might reach out his hand and take from the tree of life and eat and live forever. Up until that point, he hadn't eaten that fruit. He was mortal. I think it's clear too that pain is not a consequence of the fall of man. As a result of the eating of fruit, the woman's pain in childbirth would be greater than it otherwise would have been. She would have had some pain anyway. I don't think it's fanciful to link the increased particular pain in childbirth to the knowledge increasing effect of eating the fruit. So we have increased pain in childbirth because we have, as a result of the eating of the fruit, a vastly greater fetal head. Human fetal heads, because of our vast cognitive capacity and our massive cerebrum, are proportionally far bigger and harder to squeeze out than are the heads of non-humans. If you have lots of knowledge, or the potential for lots of knowledge, you give your mother great pain at birth. So, just pausing there, it is of course obvious that there was physical death before there was any man around to fall. There's been life on the planet for about 3.8 billion years, out of the 4.5 billion years, and almost all of the creatures that there have ever been have died. For lots of that time, there were neurons around which behaved just like mine, and which screamed as their owners were being eaten, and when their owners were diseased, just as mine screamed. So the limestone of this beautiful building is made from the shells of millions of dead sea creatures. We all live in mortuaries. In 1997, in Montana, amateur fossil hunters unearthed this 73 million year old skeleton of a Gorgosaurus. It had a hard, stony ball rattling around inside the skull. That was an osteosarcoma. It would have been very painful. The radiologist Ruth Rothschild published a finding of 29 tumours in a particularly cancer-prone group of dinosaurs, the hadrosaurs. Lots of those would have been very painful. This is all trite. There was pain, there was death before there could have been any historical fall of man. Perhaps I should deal with what St. Paul says in 1 Corinthians 15. For since death came through a man, the resurrection of the dead comes also through a man. It seems to me that the most consistent reading of the various things that Paul says in various places about this issue is that the fall causes spiritual death. It's that from which the sacrifice of Christ redeems humans. We're given spiritual bodies like his resurrection body, which are far more solid than our current physical bodies. Like the resurrection body of Jesus, they'll be able to walk through walls. The reality that we think of as physical will be to those bodies as mist. What dies is the psychical body, the soulish body, and what's raised is the spiritual body. But since I touch on soulish bodies, to use Paul's expression, I ought to say a word before I go back to that first Genesis account about the eternal fate of non-humans. For most of the time since Aristotle, it has been the almost unquestioned orthodoxy that non-humans have souls. Aristotle identified human and animal and vegetable souls. That hierarchy caused trouble, of course, but everything was ensouled until the Enlightenment, when the universe, which had previously been conceived as an organism, was reconceived as a machine. After the Enlightenment, we were allowed to hang on as humans to our own souls for a bit, but soon we were desouled too. We became machines within a machine, leading to the hemorrhage of dignity and confidence and perceived significance, which are at the root of most of our neuroses. David Bentley Hart observes rightly, I think, that in the Old Testament and the New Testament, the only image of salvation we have is cosmic. It's the image of a restored creation, which includes presumably all humans and animals and plants and everything else. He goes on to argue after Bulgakov that the sense of consciousness and individual identity, which certainly many animals have, indicates that they're spiritual beings. I don't find it necessary or possible to come to a conclusion about the precise spiritual status of animals, and I think there are problems, as I've already said, in trying to link moral significance, let alone spiritual nature, to consciousness. Isn't it enough simply to observe, as St. Paul did, that the whole creation waits in eager longing for the redemption, a redemption that happens because of what Christ has done? So, going back to Victoria Wood, will animals go to heaven? No, because no one will. There's no translation to heaven. Creation will be restored right here, and in that renewed creation there will of course be renewed animals and plants and mountains. Our own identity and our own happiness are bound inextricably and joyfully to our relationships with non-humans. If they're not there, how can we be happy? We can't be us. It's like, I suppose, one of the most potent arguments for universalism. If my beloved are not redeemed, how can I be redeemed? It's not possible to distinguish between me and them. You can't define Charles Foster except in terms of the nexus of relationships of which he is a part. So if my beloved are not part of the renewed creation, defining parts of me can't be there either. I can't be a beneficiary of redemption unless everything else is. Now, I've dealt out of order with the ultimate destiny of the created order because I had to deal with the fact that there were trillions upon trillions of physical deaths before Adam was around. But before I go further into the nature of nature, I have to go back to the Genesis accounts. Now, introductory comment about this part. The first of those Genesis accounts is in part a polemical document. It's intended to contradict the view of the world and of gods which was prevailing in Mesopotamia and in Egypt. It's an anti-polytheistic tract. Now, that's worth bearing in mind if your reverence for nature threatens to become a worship of nature or of gods in nature. And the increasing recognition of the ubiquity of consciousness makes that an increasing danger, doesn't it? A danger which in some particularly green iterations of Christianity threatens to become a blasphemous creature worship. Creatures are distinguished firmly and crucially from the creator in those accounts. So John of Damascus puts it beautifully, I don't venerate matter, but I venerate the creator of matter, who became matter for my sake, who through matter worked for my salvation. So how does that first account take issue with the religious mores of Mesopotamia and Egypt? Well, it asserts that rather than there being many gods, there's one God, in the beginning God. And so I know there's an argument about whether that first reference to God is singular or plural, but the overwhelming consensus is that it's a singular formation. Creatures aren't there at all. Creatures are different from God. The astrological cults of Mesopotamia and Egypt were insulted. So the sun and the moon and the stars are created together on day 4 after the plants, even though light itself was created on day 1. So it is saying it makes more sense to worship a cabbage than to worship the sun. If you want other examples of the denigration, go to Leon Cass's fantastic book, The Beginning of Wisdom. Everything is said to be good, apart from man and the sky. It's saying we shouldn't look to the sky or to ourselves for guidance. The individual elements of the creation, apart from man and the sky, are good, but together it's very good. And I take that to be a statement that community and cooperation and interconnectedness are of the essence of the goodness of the creation. Surely the whole was better than each part because, firstly, the object of the creation was to create a whole with each part dependent on every other. You cannot, reading those Genesis accounts, be an atomistic neoliberal. And secondly, because that interdependency mandates relationship. And God seems to have an overriding concern for relationship. He wants to relate to us. He wants us to relate to him. He wants each part of the created order to relate to every other part. So, in a sense, there are, in that ecological perspective, no parts in the created order, just as God, if the idea of divine simplicity is right, has no parts. And I take that particular celebration of the whole created order to be an expression of divine simplicity. God has no parts, the creation reflects him. Is man special in the Genesis stories? Well, the first creation story looks evolutionary. It's a process of remodeling, of dividing and calling things out from what already exists. But man's slightly different in that respect. Only man is not brought forth from the already created world. He seems to have come specifically from the wheel of God. But even man in the second account is made from the dust of the ground, precisely the same stuff as all the animals are later made from. And of course, man is made in the image of God. Humans are created as part of the same project that created everything else. Yes, on a separate day, but with slightly different words. It's true that we're specifically stated to be in the image of God, and the other animals are not. What does that entail? Well, surely it entails some sort of vice regency to which we're appointed in relation to the ruling of creation. One of the most disastrously misunderstood and abused ideas, which has often been taken as a license to exploit and extract and to kill. It should be not license, but an onerous and joyous duty. In the patristic period, there was, of course, a good deal of reflection about the nature of man and his relationship to the non-human world. That which I personally find most helpful is the thinking of St. Maximus the Confessor. So, man, as both material and spiritual, has a unique position. He can and he must act as a mediator between the spiritual and material orders. He must be a bridge linking them, an adhesive which binds them together. The union of the realms has, of course, been effected perfectly and definitively by the perfectly and definitively material and the perfectly and definitively spiritual Jesus. But all created things meet in us as humans. We're described as the imago mundi, the image of the world, and a microcosmos, a microcosm. Everything is inside us. Inside the most callous petroleum executive is the natural world. He goes to work to exploit and to destroy. And when he destroys it, he destroys part of himself. And I think that's psychologically evident in our neuroses. In the Lex Talionis, one of the reasons why it's wrong to kill humans is because to kill a human is to destroy something which is made in the image of God. It's a sort of deicide. Maximus gives us another reason not to kill humans. It's not just homicide or deicide, it's also cosmicide. So the human mission which is entailed in this idea of humans as microcosms and mediators is an awesome one. Tolleson puts it like this: man is created just for this purpose, to actualize the creative potential of his being, to achieve a fully realized community between all creatures and their creators, and their creator. Now, something like that surely has to be at the root, not just of our feelings as we walk through woods and pat our dogs, but at the root of our politics and our economic policy too. It's perhaps worth noting that lots of that strain of thought in Maximus is a specific response to the cosmology of Origen. Origen, of course, gets lots right, but he taught that the existence of the material world was the result of a fall of pre-existing intelligences who grew bored of contemplating God. Maximus has none of that. For him, the material world is a consequence of God's intention and is basically good. There's none of the body-soul dualism that does so much harm later. Souls don't pre-exist the body body doesn't pre-exist souls. So, it's time to ask whether it's possible to have a guiltless walk in the woods. The creation was said to be very good. Can we conclude from that anything about the Creator? Can we conclude from the natural world anything about what the face of God looks like when we're on the walk? You know that hymn, when through the woods and forest glades I wander and hear the birds sing sweetly in the trees, when I look down from lofty mountain grandeur and hear the brook and feel the gentle trees, then sings my soul, my Saviour God, to thee, how great thou art. Now, is that a song which we can sing if we are biologically informed? I think there are problems in doing that. They've long been recognised. At the time of the Industrial Revolution, when we first started getting worried about this, railway cuttings and canals and quarries were all disgorging evidence of all those prehistoric deaths. So in 1850, which is 9 years before The Origin of Species, Tennyson had written, so careful of the type, but no, from scooped cliff and quarried stone she cries, 1,000 types are gone, I care for nothing, all shall go. A terrible indictment to level against God. Darwin was very famously aware of all this. You will have heard his letter to Hooker. What a book a devil's chaplain might write on the clumsy, wasteful, blundering, low and horridly cruel works of nature, Richard Dawkins' favourite line. I cannot persuade myself, writing slightly later, that a beneficent and omnipotent God would have designedly created the Ichthyorhynchidae with the express intention of their feeding within the living bodies of caterpillars. Pascal observed that it was was a remarkable fact that no canonical writer has ever used nature to prove God. And anyone who knows anything about the natural world knows about its horrors. The canonical paradigm of modern biology is, of course, the neo-Darwinian one. Competition, waste, and death are the primary fuel of the biological engine. The beauty and complexity that I so admire and on which I feed and which generate my own epiphanies in the natural world, without which I feel utterly bereft, are on this account the result of horror and death and pain and selfishness. So, in enjoying my walk through the woods, am I a pervert? Is enjoying that walk through the woods like enjoying a snuff movie? It's certainly, at first blush, the naked competition and violence of the natural world seem to be at odds with the extravagant, self-giving, even to the point of death, which Christians say characterizes the Christian God. Well, in the Hebrew Bible, God seems to have a horror of predation. He created a vegetarian world. It was the vegetarian world, not the world red in tooth and claw, that was said to be very good. In the vision of the new creation in Isaiah, the wolf will lie with the lamb. There'll be no killing. In the Levitical food laws, all birds and beasts of prey are unclean. He doesn't seem to like talons or hooked beaks. Now, the Genesis account, which we've gone through, is, I take it, not history or purported history, but it's a statement of an original intention and an eventual outcome. It's a statement not that wolves ever ate tomato sandwiches, but that God is disgusted by animal pain and death. So what do we make of the Noah story, which is very strange and difficult? The only food on the ark was vegetarian. But the very first thing that the humans do on emerging from the ark is to kill sacrificially some of their animal companions and barbecue them to make a burnt offering. God's response to that, which, if I'm right, should be horror, is, I will never again curse the ground because of humankind, for the inclination of the human heart is evil from youth. Very strange thing to say in the context. He seems to be saying that until the final redemption, human hearts are so warped that they will make bad decisions, including killing and eating animals. And then God changes dramatically the relationship between man and animals, and between animals and animals. The fear and dread of you shall rest on every animal of the earth. But the prohibition on eating blood remains, presumably as a reminder that predation isn't how it was meant to be. Meat eating is allowed, but it's a resigned, disappointed dispensation, not a statement of the way things are meant to be. So, how and when were the seeds of this suboptimal, disappointing state of affairs sown? When did the corruption that resulted in Noah's barbecue start? When was the original intention temporarily thwarted? Well, for that, we have to keep back almost the very start of the story, I think. And it's a very strange tale. The text of Genesis makes two announcements about each creative act. Firstly, God announces that something will happen. Let there be light, or let the earth put forth vegetation. And that's followed by an announcement that the act has been accomplished. And there was light. But there are some discordances between the first and the second type of announcement. Discordances which are audible only in Hebrew. Only in the case of light is there a perfect match between the announcement of the imminent creation and the announcement of accomplishment. Only light does precisely what it's told. So we've got the announcement, let light be, and the response, light be. After that, there's discordance. The earth is told to grass, but the earth doesn't do that. It puts forth grass. And as the story goes on, the disobedience crescendos. So when God asks the waters to bring forth the water animals, it doesn't happen. There's no, and it was so. God, for the first time, is forced to create directly. So God created the great sea monsters. So he gets the result he wanted, but not apparently by the mechanism he wanted. So he seems to be disapproving of whatever it was that created a deviation from the immediate obedience to his command. So there's a rebellion afoot. Perhaps the rebellion started even earlier. God orders separation of the light and the darkness, but they don't separate completely. We hear, and there was evening, and there was morning. We have dawn and twilight. Night bleeds into day. Day infuses into night. C.S. Lewis observes, man was not the first creature to rebel against the Creator. Some mighty created power had already been at work, he says, for ill. It may well have corrupted the animal creation before man appeared. Now that's wholly in accord with the theology of the New Testament. We have there a struggle on with principalities and powers. It's those powers that have warped the world, made each creature diseased with a tendency to rebellion. But the project is theosis, and our ultimate destiny, a new creation. So when we walk through the wood as fallen creatures amongst fallen creatures, we can rejoice in the intention that's evident in the wood and in the destiny of the wood. And also I think in the reflection that the wood is far, far less fallen than it is corrupted. As to the suggestion that the world is wholly bad because it has been wholly shaped by the forces of death and competition and selfishness, that it is effectively a neoliberal economy. Two observations. First, in his incarnation, Christ took on all our evolutionary history. So he adopted as his ancestors bacteria, amoeba, and Jurassic shrews. So he took up and dealt with the neoliberalism in our past. So I go that far, but have difficulty in going any further with kenotic attempts to acquit God of cynical disregard for his creation or of impotence. Secondly, and I think most importantly, I reject the premise that competition is the only game in town. Cooperation and community and altruism are hugely important as drivers of the process of developing biological complexity. I haven't got time to set out the argument in any detail. I've written an extremely boring book on the subject called The Selfless Gene, if anyone wants to read it. But I'll observe now that the history of biology is a history of increasing community. You get single cells clumping together to form communities. You get single organisms participating in community. And altruism is very common in nature. Biology sees that altruism, of course, as disguised selfishness. It's far from clear that that's true. So all these are comforting thoughts as I walk through the woods. Although there are indeed sharp claws and talons, and indeed the larvae of the Ichthymonidae are eating the living body of caterpillars from within, the bulk of what we're seeing might be the result of cooperation and altruism and relationality. Perhaps I'm not a pervert after all. Perhaps it's not a snuff movie. One brief comment about imminence and transcendence. I mentioned the Eastern idea of imminence at the start. But the more I think about the notion of divine simplicity, the less useful those categories seem. And particularly, the more harmful the standoff between imminence and transcendence in the Christian tradition appears to me to be. If divine simplicity is right, transcendence is imminent, right? And vice versa. Bentley Hart again pours his characteristic eloquent scorn on what he talks about as two-tier Thomism. So the idea that there's a distinction of substance between the natural and the spiritual, the material and the divine. A misconstruction, he says, and I agree, of Aquinas' idea of grace perfecting nature, which has been, this two-tier Thomism has become popular amongst certain modern Catholics. And it's popular amongst certain Protestant constituencies because it emphasizes the role of grace in permitting the transition between the natural and the spiritual. But it's a distinction which, so far as I can see, is unknown to the New Testament, and a distinction expressly disowned by the great patristic figures. So, summarizing, nature and grace are one. There is no big gap between them. The creation's good, but as a result of the corrupting archons, it is afflicted. Each element of creation is basically good. Together, it's very good. The sea off Lindisfarne is desperate to have a prolonged nighttime conversation with you. The otters of the Northumberland coast are desperate to dry you and warm you when you come out from your experience talking to the sea. The very goodness of the whole indicates the relational structure of reality. Everything's related to everything else. We have the same origin, we have the same destiny. We are, as a matter of quantum physics as well as metaphysics, connected to everything else. Minds are not just inside skulls, but extend far beyond our skulls, entangling with other minds. The substance of individual minds is woven from the same stuff as the divine mind, and in some sense is continuous with it. We're in crisis environmentally, aren't we? That's a crisis, it would seem to me, of limits, or the lack of limits, of greed, of overarching, of irreverence. It is at root a spiritual crisis, and it can only ultimately have a spiritual solution. There's no point in telling people to limit their cosmocidal hyperconsumption unless you convince them that there's more to life than appetite, that there are values and duties and responsibilities. Humanist ethics, in trying to articulate what the relevant values and duties and responsibilities should be, has to give an account of humans that is sufficiently strong not to buckle under the weight of those awesome values and duties and responsibilities, and it can't. Only a properly dignifying account of humanity can give that. And for my money, that's the account of the Imago Dei and the Mediator and the microcosm. I came across today, and I am finishing now, I promise, Jonathan, something written by a good friend of mine who's the author Paul Kingsnorth, who has spent a lot of his life chained to bulldozers as an environmental activist, and has very recently converted to orthodoxy. And he wrote this: in the kingdom of man, the seas are ribboned with plastic, the forests are burning, the cities bulge with billionaires and tented camps. Still we kneel before the idol of the great God, economy as it grows and grows like a cancer cell. And what if this ancient faith, Christianity is talking about, is not an obstacle after all, but a way through? As we see the consequences of eating the forbidden fruit, of choosing power over humility, separation over communion, the stakes become clearer each day. Surrender or rebellion, sacrifice or conquest, death of the self or triumph of the will, the cross or the machine. And that's how I see it too. I'll shut up and you can tell me how radically misconceived my theology of nature is. But thank you for your patience.
So at Charles Foster has agreed to join us for evening prayer, a sung evening prayer in the smaller part of the front of the chapel, the Blessed Sacrament Chapel, which will go toward at 25 past the hour, which gives us about 10 minutes, 15 minutes for questions. So I'd like to begin really quickly and ask you about space issues after the resurrection. It just seems like we might not all fit, right?
So all the ways in which we think about the world are constrained by the really boring quotidian way in which our present bodies act. So we know in our everyday experience only about 3 spatial dimensions and 1 temporal dimension. We know as a matter of fact that our brains are wired up with neural networks so sophisticated that we are capable of experiencing 11 dimensions. So we seem to be wired up for a lot more than we normally use. A little while ago I dislocated my shoulder and I went off to the JR and they gave me gas and air while they tried to wrench it back. And as a result of inhaling this substance, and I'm certain it was I, rose out of a body which is probably the body that you see here, or has had some connection with it, and looked down upon it with some interest. It wasn't a very intimate interest. I regretted the fact this body had pain, which I could still locate in the shoulder of this thing, even though I wasn't this thing. I could see my bald head sweating under the bombardment of all the nervous impulses going through my shoulder. I could see the centre parting of the nurse as he struggled to wrench it back. But there was no doubt about the difference between the eye up here and the body down here. Eventually, the two coincided again after I stopped inhaling. But I could see while I was hovering up there the outline of my own skull, which is one reason why I said with confidence a few moments ago that mind and body are not the same. I could see the outline of my skull, and yet I was outside the skull, which encased the whole of my brain. It's a very common experience amongst people who have out-of-body experiences of that sort, that they can see, almost as I did, 360-degree versions of themselves, which is precisely what you'd expect if you flipped into a 4th dimension. Goodness knows what you'd experience if you went into the 5th or 6th of the 11 dimensions, which even now we are wired up to experience. Perhaps our beloved dead are in dimension 8 or 9. If you talk to any quantum physicists, they will tell you that the whole notions of space and time, as we commonly discuss them now, are redundant. There is either a unity of those 3 dimensions and the 4th time, or they are so meaningless in the context of the other ways of construing the structure of reality that we shouldn't talk in that way at all. So for all that confused bundle of reasons, I think there's probably going to be room. So space is not going to behave in remotely the way that we are accustomed to it behaving.
So I had Robert Jackson and Clinton Collister. Why don't you put your hand up for others if you have a question, and I'll get round to you. Paulinda, Ms. Fraser, I see one over there from nothing else. So, Go ahead, Robert. Robert Jackson.
Talk about the nature of all things is inevitably going to be metaphorical talk.
Yes.
And there are a number of different metaphors, but let's just take two. One I will call the theistic metaphor, which is transcendence. Transcendent God who creates the world.
Yeah.
And man fits into that picture. Another is pantheistic. Everything is God. There are two very powerful and very interesting metaphors. They inform very large parts of human culture. Are they compatible? I feel about your talk that really you're coming out of the theistic tradition and trying to reinterpret it in the pantheistic tradition. Can that work? Is it interesting? Yes. How serviceable will it be? I wonder about that.
I don't think they're going out of the theistic tradition at all. I think the notion of transcendence, which I've talked about, maps very well onto what I think is probably behind what you mean when you talk about the theistic position. And I acknowledge that transcendence has been the normal lens in which our doctrines of God have been framed in the West. All that I wanted to say is that right from the very beginning, there have been other types of language in which it has been found necessary to talk about God if we're not to have a notion which is plainly inadequate. I think most people would acknowledge that the vertically oriented language, merely transcendence, fails to capture lots of our intuitions about the divinity within us and the divinity within the non-human creation. It certainly fails to capture lots of the science which has emerged over the last 75 years or so about the way that fundamental particles behave and about the entanglement of minds. If one goes back to our very earliest human history, we have in behaviourally modern humans clear indications of a belief that the boundary between us and the rest of creation is an extremely porous one. We bleed into it and it bleeds into us. The whole of Christian theology piggybacks on the back of that tradition.